Barbara Lundblad is the professor of preaching at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. She tells the story of passing a church on the street in New York where the Sunday sermon title was listed in big letters on the reader board. The title of the coming sermon was "Following Jesus is Loving and Practical." She writes, "I began to argue with that sign. I argued aloud in my car, talking to nobody but myself. I don't think so," she said. "Following Jesus may be loving, but it's surely not very practical." I began to make a list in my head of all the impractical things Jesus calls us to do. But just then the light turned green and the car behind me started honking. I never got to finish the argument. And I have wondered ever since what that minister had to say on that Sunday morning. She's right, isn't she? Following Jesus is definitely walking the way of love. But when it comes to being practical, it's not. Especially if we turn to the gospel reading for today, because Jesus is telling us to do nearly the impossible. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Practical? I don't think so. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Come on, Jesus. Let's be realistic. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, now that's better, huh? That sounds a little more practical, like something you might see on a poster in a school hallway or in a corporate boardroom, a beautiful full-color photograph, people of different races working together, or children from around the world holding hands in a big circle, and over the picture are the words, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Now that makes sense. We know these words as the golden rule, right? And you probably know they're not unique to Jesus. Indeed, they're found not only in Luke and in Matthew, but in the writings of Homer and Seneca and Philo. In fact, in one form or another, the golden rule is a part of every major religion in the world. This is the kind of wisdom we learned in kindergarten when the teacher told us to treat other people the way we would like to be treated. I think sometimes it is tempting to boil the whole Bible down to one verse like this. It's a verse, after all, people can understand. It sounds like practical wisdom about getting along in the world. But it is not possible to boil the Bible down to one verse, no matter how good that verse happens to be. If we were to pull the golden rule out of this chapter from the Sermon on the Mount and say this is a summary of everything Jesus said, it's likely that we will miss most of what Jesus said. We have to go back to where Jesus began. Remember, he started with these words, "Love your enemies." And he says it not only once, but he repeats it again a few verses later. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Thus, the golden rule applies even when we sense that someone won't treat us the way we'd like to be treated. This is where it gets very hard. This kind of behavior we think is impractical, but it can also seem downright dangerous. Jesus' words about turning the other cheek or giving up your shirt along with your coat, they seem demeaning in the extreme. Well, let's remember that Jesus most likely is speaking here to those who were victims rather than victimizers, to those who were oppressed rather than their oppressors. But Jesus is not calling victims to roll over and play dead. It's really hard for us to see that, for it sounds like Jesus is telling victims to be quiet, to keep taking it. New Testament scholar and fellow Montanan, Walter Wink, has helped us see something far different. Now, he works primarily in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew's version of the story, but the same insights can be applied to Jesus' words here in Luke. Strange as it may seem to us, Walter Wink sees Jesus' words as a form of non-violent resistance to oppression. Now, it's tricky because we have to understand something about the culture in which Jesus lived. In the culture of first century Palestine, a person's left hand was used for, well, let's just say, bathroom duties. I know it's not pleasant to think about this, but it meant that you would never strike a person with your left hand. And if you were superior to another person, you would always strike them with the back of your right hand. Never with the palm of your hand, for that would mean you'd see them as an equal. So now this is the picture Jesus is painting. If someone strikes you on the cheek, it will most likely be with the back of their hand. For remember, Jesus is talking to victims here, so your oppressor will not see you as an equal. He'll likely hit you with the back of his hand. If you turn your face to the side, you force your oppressor to see you as an equal. Even your oppressor won't use his left hand. Some things simply weren't done. So Jesus wants us to see an almost comical situation here. The oppressor's hand begins to swing, but it is caught in midair because he doesn't want to treat you as an equal by hitting you with an open palm. The same, I think, humorous resistance comes in giving up your shirt when your oppressor asks for your coat. Now, this isn't the case of giving up an old coat to the winter coat drive. Jesus is talking about something completely different here. It's likely that someone asks for your coat in repayment for a debt. You owe your oppressor something, and since you have no land and very little money, your oppressor asks for your very coat. Now, there were very clear restrictions regarding the repayment of debts. You could not leave a debtor naked at sundown, no matter what he or she owed you. It's simply not done. It was against every sense of decency and good order. So I think Jesus is setting up another strategy of resistance. If they ask for your coat, give them your shirt too. And then you'll be standing there half naked, and they'll be forced to deal with this new reality that you have just set up. And no, they say, I don't want your shirt, put it back on. And they might just be so disarmed that they'll return your coat as well. I think these verses have been misunderstood. Jesus is not telling people to remain victims, but to find new ways of resisting evil. Love your enemies, Jesus said. Do good to those who hate you. This is the very ethic that moved Martin Luther King Jr. to kneel down with many brothers and sisters before those water hoses and snarling police dogs. Many people thought he was crazy. Only violence can fight violence, they told him. But the authorities and the oppressors didn't know what to do with this kind of resistance. They knew the power of violence. They knew the powerlessness of victims who knew their place. But this was something they hadn't seen before. Victims who refused to be victims. Victims who refused to fight back with violence. Victims who claimed their place and reshaped the battle completely. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. And he also says, don't be too impressed with yourself for being good to your friends. Anybody can do that, Jesus says. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to only those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners loan to sinners to receive as much again. So, just when we have the golden rule memorized, Jesus reminds us that it is far deeper than how we treat our friends. It's far deeper than what we hope to receive. It's even different from treating others the way we hope to be treated. Because Jesus comes back again and again to the place where he began. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. It's not practical. It's not practical at all. Not in the sense of getting ahead in the world or doing what comes naturally. When I hear these words from Jesus now, I can't help but think of, well, several people. But this week I thought about Matthew Shepard's mother. Do you remember Matthew Shepard? He was brutally beaten for being gay. Beaten because one man felt that he had made a pass at him. And that made that man feel foolish and unmanly, and so he got a friend to come along and help him put this young college student in his place. The two of them beat Matthew Shepard over and over again. And then they tied him to a fence on a country road and left him alone in the freezing night. By the time someone found him the next morning and got him to the hospital, it was too late. There was no way to save him. So Matthew Shepard died as hundreds of people stood in a candlelight vigil outside the hospital. The two men who killed Matthew were arrested, they were tried, and they were convicted of this brutal hate crime. They were proved guilty of first-degree murder. And in the state of Wyoming, they deserved the death penalty. But Matthew's mother came along. And she went before the judge. And she asked that judge to spare the lives of these two young men. Now, who can possibly understand what she had gone through all those agonizing months leading up to the trial? What mother could sleep at night with images of her beloved son tied to a fence, beaten and alone through the cold night? What sort of people could do this to another human being? Love your enemies, Jesus said. Do good to those who hate you. When we hear Jesus' words now, think of Matthew's mother, because her own life was shaped by a gospel deeper than hatred, stronger than revenge. I don't know that I could do what she did, but I hold her in my heart as a witness to the power of the gospel. No, such love is not practical, but it can change the world. Amen.